Welcome back to the AHA Online Teacher Institute, Native Peoples and the Architecture of U.S. History. Before I hand it over to our chair and moderator for this session and our distinguished guest, a couple of notes about housekeeping. First, just to let you know, we are recording this session. The chat is also open, so feel free to chime in there. But if you have a question for Dr. Blackhawk, please make sure that you use the Q&A portal at the bottom of the screen, just to make sure that it is bumped up to our attention. I'd like to start today by introducing my colleague who will introduce Dr. Blackhawk. Whit Barringer is a researcher for the AHA's Mapping the Landscape of Secondary History Education project. You heard from her colleague, Nick Kritschka, in the first session. Whit earned her BA from the University of Central Arkansas and her MA and PhD from the University of Mississippi. She taught within the University of Central Arkansas's Norbert O. Shedler Honors College and the History Department for 5 years before joining the AHA. Whit?
Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm very happy to be here, to be another face on the call today. In our first session earlier today, you heard from my colleague, Nick Kritschka, who shared some of the findings of the AHA's Mapping the Landscape of Secondary Education research project, which identified broad demand amongst teachers across the country for professional development programming focused on Native American history. We also welcome Dr. Sarah Scheer of the University of Washington, Bothell, for a conversation about how to discuss Native peoples in the classroom and some insights from her research on how state standards represent Indigenous histories and cultures. This panel borrows its title Toward a New American History from the introduction to our guest's most recent book. Dr. Ned Blackhawk is an enrolled member of the Timoke tribe of the Western Shoshone. He is the Howard R. Lamar Professor of History and American Studies at Yale University. His many publications include The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples, and the Unmaking of U.S. History, which won the 2023 National Book Award in Nonfiction, and Violence Over the Land, Indians and Empires in the Early American West. In addition to his work as a scholar educator, Professor Blackhawk has led the establishment of 2 fellowships, one for American Indian students to attend the Western History Association's annual conference, and the other for doctoral students working on American Indian study dissertations at Yale, named after Henry Rowe Cloud, Winnebago, class of 1910. After a presentation from Ned, we'll field questions from the audience. As you watch and listen, please feel free to submit questions through the Q&A portal on Zoom. At this moment, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Blackhawk. Please take us away.
Hello, I'm really happy to be here and excited to talk with the AHA's virtual community in this forum. My name is Ned Blackhawk. I teach Native American history at Yale University and spent many years before that teaching at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where I was on the faculty from 1999 to 2009. Native American history has become, an incredibly rich and growing field of academic and scholarly interest. It's seeping into American higher education and popular consciousness a bit, often aided by various media and popular cultural forums of various kinds. Killers of the Flower Moon was a recent, obviously, a Martin Scorsese production that brought much attention to contemporary Native American history of the Oklahoma area. And this field is, quite powerful when entered into, in part because it challenges so many of the kind of received categories of analysis that we've been given to understand American history, and partly because it also almost requires a certain new capacity or method for thinking a lot more differently about American history through non-binary types of organizations and or kind of conceptualizations. So I've been teaching this field for 25 years now. I was in graduate school before then and undergraduate education even before that. And I, was a high school student myself at some point in time. And it really shouldn't shock many of us to hear that this is probably the least understood component of American historical experiences, broadly speaking. And I believe that's one of the findings that the AHA and its team of researchers, including Dr. Barringer, are kind of identifying and trying to redress. So I, in my early years of teaching at the University of Wisconsin, struggled to make sense of this field as an instructor. I knew what kind of characterized much of the literature in the field, but by and large, there were no really good textbooks. The best and still most cited or used course text for an American Indian history class is actually a documentary history collection called First Peoples by my colleague and friend at Dartmouth College named Colin Calloway, who has been doing Native American history for a very long time. So I was very dissatisfied with the kind of pedagogical resources available. And over time, after teaching and working and thinking, a great deal about Native American history, decided I would try to challenge that pedagogical absence, so to speak, and do so in a way that reflected, in my mind, what the field of Native American history looked like professionally, what it had become, so to speak, but also do so in a way that kind of emphasized what I think are some of its key insights and takeaways, so to speak. So I'm really engaged in trying to recenter conventional understandings of American history through this subject, or at least I think I am, or trying, I pride myself in certain ways in doing that. That is not to say that this is the only way of approaching Native American history. And parallel to this effort have been many other efforts to prioritize local, regional, or what we might call tribal historical perspectives and experiences. So there are kind of a variety of potential avenues to follow if one is interested in learning more and teaching more effectively in this area and or challenging what I call the general erasure of American Indians from American history. In fact, I think one of the most useful perspectives in the kind of world of Native American studies engagement and teaching is to focus on local subject matters. All corners of the American continent, all states in the Union, all school districts therein have local indigenous histories that remain often misunderstood, exiled, or somehow erased more broadly from public and intellectual engagement. So partnering with tribal communities, if you're able, bringing visiting speakers, using resources, perhaps even taking tours of cultural landscapes. There are all kinds of ways, essentially, of engaging this field. So the project that I'm talking about is more of a kind of historical overview or a kind of structural analysis of American history or North American historical development, but it is not by any means the only one. And in fact, as I begin or open in the first chapter of the introduction of my recent book, this project, the Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of U.S. History, it builds upon a generation of scholars who have been working prodigiously and tirelessly to fill in these absent moments of American historical development, to reorganize understandings of certain subjects, to offer alternative perspectives, to share new research findings and or methods. Native American history has become a burgeoning scholarly community and professional world, and its insights unsettle, or as I say, unmake many of the kind of operative assumptions about American history. So I developed the book in this kind of chronological form that takes two halves. And the first half, or each half is 6 chapters that roughly cover certain kind of periods of American historical uh, formation and expose the centrality of indigenous peoples to them. So one of the kind of takeaways, so to speak, of this approach is to think of conventional subjects of American historical development: the Civil War, the New Deal era, the Spanish arrival, and to see how central indigenous peoples remain to those eras, and also how important those eras remain for Native peoples, historically speaking. So the takeaway is that it's impossible to understand American history without engagement with indigenous peoples, and there are within that process of inquiry new perspectives or new potential theories of American history that we might advance. I can't summarize all of them now, or kind of begin to kind of extrapolate some of the so-called legacies of what this history might entail, but it does mean a kind of fundamental reordering of visions of American history that, for example, focus on an east to west teleology. The idea that the American historical experience, so to speak, begins in New England and culminates many centuries thereafter, is one of the kind of longest standing temporalities that relegate Native Americans to certain um, marginal positions. Not only were the Puritan settlers, as I write in chapter 2, relative latecomers to Eastern North America, following their British countrymen or their English countrymen in the Chesapeake almost 2 decades prior. They are the last, major European imperial power to gain a foothold in Eastern North America, or they're part of the last English efforts. The Dutch precede the English to the northeast. The French are settling the St. Lawrence in the early 1600s, and the Spanish, who occupy the first chapter of the book, are obviously crisscrossing much of the continent, beginning in the relatively first decades of the 1500s. So there's a deep-seated attempt in the field of Native American history to move past what we might call the Anglo-centric vision of America, to expose alternative, not just temporalities, but periodizations and kind of spatial orientations that foreground non-Anglophone speakers, whether they be French or Spanish, or importantly, indigenous. Relatedly, to think of the history of North America along a kind of black-white racial bias or axes is another form of kind of binary conceptualization that this field helps dismantle. Of course, there have been multiple forms of historical oppression that have shaped the American experience, and Native American dispossession is a central and enduring part of a larger history of American racial formation and discrimination and injustice. To think about American history otherwise reinscribes these older visions of America that are rooted in less inclusive paradigms and forms of analysis. So much of the book highlights the centrality of indigenous peoples to forms of American historical development in which Native Americans are one of many subordinated communities working within and against often American structures of exclusion, whether they be citizenship acts or naturalization processes during the early republic, whether they be civil rights initiatives of the 20th century, whether they be kind of larger cultural understandings informing visions of American intellectuals in the 19th century. These are all realms in which Native Americans are constitutive participants in a larger mosaic, essentially, of American diversity. So this book is kind of seeped in those types of interventions, and it's less focused on the particular tribal communities whom I kind of suggested earlier are the focus of other scholars and sets of initiatives. I don't think of them as mutually exclusive attempts, but I think it's helpful to understand the kind of broader frame of analysis in American historical formation and to see the changing developments between particularly Europeans and later American state leaders and native nations as central dynamics. And so there are a whole series of kind of insights or takeaways that might be helpful to kind of think through. But these are the kind of broad general contours that contextualize the project as a whole. I'm also particularly excited to share and talk about the maps that are in this book. And the book came out in April of 2023, and there's a paperback coming this fall at some point that will have a teacher's guide associated with it online. And it will be hopefully more useful for class instruction and other kind of community undertakings in that form. But the hardback has within it in the front and end maps, which you won't be able to see in this kind of brief presentation, a set of maps that highlight the place of Native Americans within the contiguous United States and identify both the pre-contact general estimations of Native nations locations using the ethnographic designations or tribal names that tribes have historically used to describe themselves. That's in the first map, and the last map is a map of contemporary federally recognized Indian reservations and state recognized communities within the contiguous United States. These maps help communicate essentially the larger argumentation of the book as a whole that begins with the kind of indigenous world and goes through series of encounters, transformations, developments, and other forms of historical transformation that concludes with contemporary communities, reservations, whom many Americans very rarely learn about. So the book is not in many ways by no means exhaustive, but it has this kind of attempt to highlight somewhat maybe exhaustively the diversity of contemporary and pre-contact indigenous peoples, at least in these cartographic forms. So that's what the book generally is about. I'm happy to talk a lot more about the specifics within certain chapters. I was just kind of brushing up on some of the early 20th century materials for some other effort, and kind of was reminded at how dire the circumstances were for Native Americans during what is known as the reservation era, when the federal government was systematically trying to expropriate indigenous people's land and take their children and educate them in faraway boarding schools. That's the themes of later chapters in the book, but those are the types of subject matters that one would find throughout the text. I think I'm going to kind of abbreviate this kind of general overview at this time and welcome kind of more sustained or focused questions and engagements to follow. I hope this has been helpful and look forward to our continued conversations and engagements at this time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blackhawk. Just to kind of get us started, I'd like to ask, your book it offers a synthesis. Like you said, you're building on a very active field that is, taking on questions and investigating them and trying to build this knowledge that we have about Native American history and histories, right? And I was curious, what do you see in reviewing your book and reviewing the literature? What do you see as the three biggest questions that are driving scholarship in the field right now?
Well, that's not a anticipated question, so I might have to kind of briefly meditate.
Sure.
And I'll even repeat it to myself just so I can think through it a little more carefully. What are the three biggest questions driving the study of Native American history at the moment?
In the scholarship. Mm-hmm.
In the scholarship. So I would say among the three, these are not in ranked order, but there is a kind of driving question in the scholarship around Native American history as to what constitutes the political and legal relationship between the American nation state and native nations upon it. It's Native peoples are identified both in the Declaration and in the Constitution, but most revolutionary historians, most constitutional and legal historians don't know much about this larger subject. It's part of that larger form of erasure that I mentioned. And so one of the key questions is not just historically, but it has some kind of implications because American legal institutions like the Supreme Court often are struggling to answer this question as well. Are American Indians a racial or political community in America? That is a question that the American courts have been dealing with for half a century. And it's related to this kind of larger question in the scholarship about what constitutes the nature of that relationship. It'd take me a long time to fully answer what constitutes that relationship, but that is one of the driving questions. What is the legal history between the United States and Native nations, and how does it fit into larger understandings of American history more broadly? So one of the interesting components of this conversation that I talk about in the Civil War chapter, which I think is chapter 9, is that Native Americans are excluded from the Reconstruction amendments that follow the South surrender. In both the 14th Amendment and in the Civil Rights Act of 1866, American Indians are left out of essentially these forms of expansionary legal inclusiveness that the Reconstruction Congress is attempting, in part because states and territories in the West are still dealing with indigenous peoples who are not subject to U.S. laws and are often at war with them, but in part because there's still a general uncertainty about whether or not American Indians are citizens or subject to be citizens or fit to be citizens of the American Republic. That's the kind of American government side. From the Native American perspective, there's often been a much less kind of organized interest in American voting rights or other forms of citizenry protections than there are in protections over tribal lands and autonomous structures therein. So this is just one question, and I'm not answering your other two, but this is the nature of that type of question. What is that relationship? Yeah. Another question might be, in what ways have Native Americans helped lay the foundations for the emergence of the United States? And so that's more of like a U.S. colonial history question. And most of the generation of scholarship that I talked about, or much of it, has been heavily influential in the reorientation of what used to be called U.S. colonial history. No longer is it largely the study of just Puritans, patriots, and presidents, but of a kind of borderlands world of multiple imperial and indigenous actors. And so the part one of the book, the first 6 chapters, is entitled Indians and Empires, that tries to highlight the kind of heterogeneity of experiences and imperial indigenous relations that are at the heart of sets of empires or regional formations across North America. This question is less pressing than it used to be, maybe 10 or 15, 20 years ago. But borderlands and early American history have helped really drive the reorientation of American history that this book is trying to name and identify. That reorientation has been far less successful in reframing what we might call the national history of the United States. And that's why the second half of the book is called Struggles for Sovereignty, which is about not just Native American, but even U.S. State struggles for sovereignty in this world turned upside down, so to speak, after American independence. We've been taught far too many times that American independence and U.S. constitutional formation were natural and inevitable processes, which they were not. And even our founding fathers struggled mightily to figure out what the best forms of governance would be in this post-independence world. So they were struggling for sovereignty, and they're doing so amidst the kind of range of peoples, native nations included, who also were struggling for sovereignty or trying to maintain a differential relationship with the American Republic as it expanded. So that question about, what is the centrality of indigenous peoples to the formation of the United States hasn't been fully answered, but a lot of material has been established to help answer it. And I would think a last question might be driving the scholarship. It's less present in this book, which takes a larger temporality than other studies. But there's been a lot of attention to what constitutes what we might call an American Indian intellectual tradition. What are the primary and principal ways that Native Americans have thought about, confronted intellectually, and resisted ideologically the imposition of external influence upon their lands? Do Native Americans have a kind of particular communal ethic that drives their kind of collective decision making? Do they have certain relationships with both land and non-human species that are at the heart of their kind of cultural orientations? And how have they incorporated or not certain new doctrines of understanding brought to them by other peoples like Christianity or Euro-American political philosophy? There is a kind of growing field of Native American intellectual history that this book kind of touches upon in its latter chapters that others have helped establish. So I would say those are the kind of three of the many motivating questions at the moment.
Yeah, a wonderful answer to that question, and really informational and exciting to hear that those are the things that are being researched right now. We have a question from Jenny Banowitz. In your book, you mentioned many times that there was a constant tension between the state and federal governments on how to address Native concerns prior to the Civil War. Would it be fair to use this fact as another way to examine the tensions about the power struggle of states' rights, as well as highlight the complexity of Indigenous experiences?
Yes, it would be, what's the right word? What did Jenny say? It'd be
Fair.
fair.
Yeah.
And so one of the realms of understanding that Native American legal and political history offer is that the founders inherited English claims to North America that held within them hardly any to at times no English speakers. And so the 13 colonies turned states had to come up with a new system of governance, both during the Revolution and also afterwards, to run an independent republic. And in that process, as we all know, numerous compromises emerged where states delegated certain authorities to the new federal government, and the federal government ensured the protection of certain states and political rights in this evolving system. States all cede that authority over Indian affairs to the federal government in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. That means that only the federal government has jurisdictional and political governance over Native nations. At the time, the federal government was very weak and new, obviously. And so it inherits and utilizes previous diplomatic practices that England and other European empires had deployed with Native nations, including the making of treaties. And so Chapter 7, which is about the early republic, highlights how important treaty making ultimately became to the early republic with Native nations. And that's one way of, in effect, so to speak, of exposing that the federal government and Native nations are doing something at a certain level that states themselves have limited input upon. And that's why the Constitution guarantees or establishes this relationship with the federal government for Native nations, but also says that treaties are the supreme law of the land. And so treaties are something that very few Americans likely feel that they are involved with. But for many Native nations, the treaties that their ancestors and leaders signed with federal agents and officials are still operative. They're still governing systems. They still have certain prerogatives that are or are not maintained. And so in that struggle over treaty rights, states often are unaware of them, or don't care about them, intrude upon them. And so there's a series of examples in the 20th century chapters of how Native nations are fighting essentially states like the state of Washington for the enforcement of federal treaty protections over their fishing rights, or they're fighting the state of Wisconsin for restoring reservation authority to the Menominee Nation of Wisconsin. So Native nations have to confront what is, and they essentially constitute an alternative rail or kind of fourth pillar of American jurisprudence that very few people, like in the field of political science would ever think about or teach. But in fact, there are Native nations who self-govern upon the American government, upon the American continent, who have sometimes tens, if not hundreds of thousands of members, regulate, Navajo Nation is 26,000 square miles, has 250,000 citizens. That kind of form of governance and regulatory relationship is done outside of or in very limited partnership with state governments. So states are not the exclusive form of alternative sovereignty within the American political system, even though we've often been taught that they are.
Thank you so much for that answer. We have another question from Catherine Norris. As a college professor, how do you most wish your students, high school teachers, had framed the central narrative of their U.S. history survey courses? I've been wanting to explode the version I've taught, but feel several tensions in reconceptualizing the overarching structure.
I don't think I have a firm understanding of how college students arrive with U.S. historical knowledge, generally speaking, in part because many come from different backgrounds and experiences. But by and large, American historical teaching and even professional activity has increasingly focused on the modern era. And it seems like the AP history classes and tests and other kind of popular understandings of American history short shrift the antebellum era, and offer us very limited kind of grounding in elemental questions like constitutional formation or revolutionary history, let alone kind of early colonial history. So any attempt to break apart an understanding of American history that is synonymous with 20th century global domination or superpower economic and political status, any sense to kind of de-exceptionalize the United States as the lone, kind of or preeminent national power of the 21st century, to expose the undetermined nature of the American past, the divisions within it, particularly during the Civil War era, the fact that the Union collapsed and then reconstituted itself, is a fact in and of itself that highlights the undetermined nature of the American experience. So whatever we can do to remind our students that history is a process of formation that is not kind of inevitable or teleological, would be kind of one recommendation. If one were moving more deeply into the subject, one could say things like history is best understood not as a process of individual decision-making, informing or kind of disseminating itself into other social communities, but a real kind of dialectic of engagement between a multiplicity of people struggling together to make sense of the world and or form decisions upon it. There's a precarity of resources, a kind of inherent a kind of challenging relationship with the natural environment, that are kind of elemental to American historical formation in ways that we in modern society often lose sight of. It's cold, for example, much of the year in the American historical universe. People are less mobile, less um, interactive during those long winters, historically speaking, in places like, I don't know, Minnesota or New Hampshire. What do they do though? How do they organize themselves? What kind of local economies or societies and cultures had they fashioned? You can ask that question of 17th or 19th century America. There are lots of ways of kind of moving past a sense of American, not just exceptional um, growth and development, but also comfort, a sense of American kind of manifest materialism, so to speak, that many of us have grown up with.
Wonderful, thank you. And a lot of appreciation for that answer from the question asker, Catherine Norris. So another question for you, just going right through these. And also I want to remind everyone, we're getting questions through the Zoom Q&A feature. Please feel free to ask questions there. We've got quite a few that are coming in. Professor Maya Hargett asked about, she's been doing research on Underground Railroads and found a good relationship between African Americans or a good Afro-Indigenous relationship between while doing that research. And she's curious about what other connections have you found between Indigenous people and African Americans, and how has that relationship developed over time?
Oh, that's a great question. And there's been a lot of scholarship on what kind of became known for a while as Black Indian studies. Because if we think of American racial formation as involving inherently the American state and its multiple kind of racialized subjects, if we see that as the kind of primary structure, it limits understandings of the ways in which racialized subjects often interacted with themselves outside of the purview of white settlers or state leaders. And so the field of Black Indian studies kind of helped in the early 21st century, expose these kind of alternative moments of racial formation in which Indigenous and African American subjects together responded to and or remade their social environments and worlds. This is particularly true in like the late 18th century and throughout the 19th century. And most of the kind of leading scholarship focused on places like the Southeast. And I mentioned some of these places a bit in my book about things like the Seminole War of the teens and 20s, the removal of indigenous peoples from the Southeast, some of whom included not just African slaves, but people who had been incorporated into indigenous societies either through marriage or what we might call naturalization, and then the migration of Southeastern tribes or the removal to Oklahoma. And so there's a range of kind of subjects. And so this person writing on Kansas, doesn't surprise me that perhaps this relationship, I think she called it, is occurring on the perimeters of these social dynamics, so to speak. So we should understand that in 1750 and 1800, even as late as 1850, there was no such thing as these terms we use for Indian or Black American were they were socially determined, and the locations mattered in which one held or was recognized as holding these types of identities. So I'm really impressed by some of the classic scholarship in these areas that have exposed these subjects. And they often have a certain level of tragedy to them because these alternative social relations essentially in which indigenous peoples, usually often American Indian women and African American men or descendant Afro freedmen, as they often became known, their relationships over time became tragically kind of um, transformed. Um, and so one of the kind of legacies of Reconstruction in the American South, obviously, is the kind of growing re-entrenchment of prior forms of racial restriction that culminated in Jim Crow segregation. And similar things are happening in Indian country or in Indian territory and in other places in North America, where former kind of socially mobile, uh, either Black or Indigenous communities became increasingly restricted by new racial practices, laws, and policies that held little space for recognition of diversity in these terms. And so many of the kind of former Southeastern tribes relocated to Oklahoma become essentially participants in the remaking of racial practices in the region, and essentially become upholders of certain degrees of white supremacy in certain ways. They exclude African freedmen or other Afro-Indigenous peoples from their census records. They start emulating white dress and political behavior and certain kind of refinements, and begin contributing to a kind of dismissal of alternative forms of social social relationships between Black and Indian peoples.
Wonderful, thank you. We have another question. Well, actually, we have several questions that are about the 250th anniversary of the U.S. that's coming up.
Hey.
And can you go into what this can you expand on what this era means and how your book helps us understand the revolution and the significance of the 250th better?
I'd be happy to. And it's one of the things that I started realizing right after the book came out and I was done, was that this chapter in particular, chapter 5, called The Indigenous Origins of the American Revolution, had a lot more to it than I had time to offer. And I really am very appreciative of the time I had to finish that chapter, because it makes an argument that I felt that long needed to be made. And the argument is this, and we can speak in a slightly less academic vernacular and kind of adopt perhaps more of a kind of everyday form of parlance on this. The Declaration concludes its list of grievances against the King of England with the claim that the King of England has been inciting, quote, merciless Indian savages to, quote, attack our frontier communities. There's a scholar by the name of Robert Parkinson who calls this, in a book called The Common Cause, the crescendo of the Declaration. And so in 1776, the founders and the colonial community felt that this was the most egregious violation of their liberties that the King of England was initiating. How is it that the Declaration of Independence hasn't been taught in this perspective? I mean, and so it's not just the term merciless Indian savage. Where does that come from? But this idea of frontier communities. So the grievances of these interior white settlers are a precipitating variable in the revolutionaries and the revolution's outbreak. A principal, though not primary cause. It makes it into the Declaration, and the Constitution, which we already talked about, is a kind of modification of these sentiments. But there's clearly a level of what we might call anti-Indigenous ideology and or rhetoric trafficking across the colonial world that is aggrieved, not because colonists feel that Indians are inherently merciless, which they might, but that sentiment has only recently come into being because their fathers may have treated with or traded with or even intermarried potentially with native nations. They knew the French had traveled all across North America, had socialized and even worshipped alongside Indians. They didn't like the French for doing that, but they know that they had done it. And they're familiar with Indians within their midst, some of whom fight on behalf of the revolution. And so this kind of monolithic kind of image of a savage Indian is becoming part of the revolutionary formation in ways that historians have just not sufficiently unpacked. And there are a small number of people that I do heavily draw upon who have done this work, but we need to do more of it. And so I think turning to that moment allows us to see these things. And it's not pretty because this ideology, one scholar even called it a metaphysics of Indian hating, is driving certain types of behavior that are not just violent, but almost anti-political. They defy political forms. Prior to the British surrender, during the revolution itself, or at every chapter essentially of the settlement of a place like the Ohio River Valley, anti-Indian behaviors and ideas are fueling what we might call anti-political behaviors, or behaviors that are beyond the state or anti-establishment. There's a sense of vigilantism and kind of racial antipathy that motivates and legitimates ranges of behaviors across this region that historians have yet to fully understand. And so the emphasis of that chapter, and perhaps some other work I might be doing, is to show how that interior cauldron of what one scholar is calling an American heart of darkness has essentially not only been ignored historically speaking, but was it itself helping to inform the subsequent behaviors of other American political leaders and philosophers who were trying to bring order to essentially a world of disorder. But it's a great question, and I'm not sure where I'll be on July 4th, 2026, or where any of us will be. But hopefully we as a nation will be more receptive to complex rather than simplistic narratives of that subject matter.
Yeah, incredibly fascinating discussion, and historians being driven by the same questions that are being asked here. Historians are going to be asking themselves. So I'm excited to see more scholarship that will come out inspired by the 250th. We have another question that's focusing on students younger than your particular student body. Rebecca Moore asked, I'm a Montessori guide of 3 to 6 year olds. So pre-K and kindergarten in one classroom. I'm curious about your suggestions for instruction at a very early childhood age and how to prepare our youngest learners for the education awaiting them.
I have a 4-year-old myself, and sometimes I bristle when I encounter what are not necessarily mean-spirited, but sometimes have negative influences for youth, young toddlers, or kindergarten students. It's so structurally difficult to recognize Native Americans outside of the tropes that we've received about them that it almost seems beyond possible to establish for our students and our children understandings of the subject that are not somehow wedded to the prior, often stereotypes of previous generations. And it's really hard particularly for Native Americans who, no longer, many of whom no longer live on reservations, or families are now blended with other Euro-Americans or other non-Indigenous populations. It's very hard to explain the kind of inherent heterogeneity of Native America to others. And so we try and we keep going. So the kind of more stereotypical one-dimensionality one would see in a film like Peter Pan, which is one of Walt Disney's most successful films ever made, where Indians are considered, I think the line is cunning but not intelligent. It's hard to see past that kind of stereotypical world. And young adult educators and young adult novelists and others have worked for a long time to kind of challenge that kind of ideology. But on the same token, to construct a vision of Native Americans that are inherently kind of Pacific or anti-modern, so to speak, naturalists who live on the land or with the land, and are no longer, or outside of the kind of corrupted influences of modern life, that too has its limitations. So one scholar refers to it as the romantic versus the barbaric savage. Either way, Indians are stuck, essentially. So we have to get to the point where we can see these communities as participants in contemporary society, participants who are descended from prior worlds, like the ones we've just been discussing, in which their ancestors and others came together and often confronted one another and sometimes disagreed and even perhaps fought and killed each other. So we have to kind of understand the kind of legacies of what some scholars might call settler colonialism or oppression, alongside the kind of continued survival or presence of Native Americans upon the modern landscape. That's hard to do, in part because most of us can't name a 20th century or 21st century Native American. There are very few on maps or on stamps. If you go to Canada, Canada's replete at the moment with like cultural representations of First Nations communities. We're struggling to have any sense of contemporaneity, so to speak, though that has changed in recent years. There are now movies. We just mentioned Lily Gladstone and the Scorsese production. There are television shows like Reservation Dogs. There have been award-winning novels recently by Tommy Orange or Louise Erdrich, among others. There is, in fact, an indigenous kind of intellectual renaissance occurring at the moment that most of us would know very little outside of Indian country often about. But we're seeing it. We're kind of aware of it a little bit. But how do we get that to your kindergartner? It's hard. But I think there are ways with the kind of dedicated commitment and kind of educational awareness. One can do many things, and that's one of the themes. Actually, one of the questions you asked earlier about where is the field. The field is also trying to highlight the agentive, so to speak, generative capacity of indigenous peoples. I mentioned intellectual history, but it's also kind of political activists and other community members who, confronting often epic challenges, found ways to overcome very debilitating circumstances. So the agency of indigenous peoples is a kind of incredibly important dimension of the Native American historical community at the moment, or what we would call the historiographical community. And this book has really seeped in that tradition. So to think through highlighting, community members who overcame challenges to your young students. If we were in Seattle, we could talk about fishing rights advocates. If we were in the Great Lakes, we could talk about various political reformers. Here in the Northeast, there are tribal community members from regional communities who have garnered kind of unprecedented accomplishments for their communities that often include things like federal recognition or language revitalization efforts. But these are all largely regional rather than national figures, so to speak. So I don't have any easy answers, but that's my kind of long-winded response.
Well, thank you for that response. And I think, pointing to the difficulty of doing this and admitting that it is difficult. But I think that, as you were saying, like there are people who were trying to put to teach this history earlier, and to teach it in a more fair way, to use a word from earlier. I also just want to point out from research that the mapping team has done at the AHA that that Washington State has developed curriculum for specifically state curriculum for all grades. And my colleague Scott is going to post that in the chat as a resource, but it shows you what an approach to how to teach not only in high school, but in earlier grades as well, and covering more time periods than conventional
I just put a link in.
Oh, great. Oh, wonderful. Yeah.
Wisconsin project. And I don't know if I can even share a screen.
Oh, no, wait, do we have that ability?
Yes,
Oh,
you do.
yes, we do. Okay, you can share your screen.
Okay, these are short. But if we did I share it? Let's see, I'll share right now. Let's see what happens when I do this. Can you see my
Yes.
screen? Okay.
Yes, I can. Mhm.
Okay, so I know what you guys have been doing a lot of research around state educational requirements. And I believe
That's correct.
in 1990, the state of Wisconsin initiated the first of these called Act 31. Or one of the earliest ones, which mandated K through 12 Indian education, in part because the state had gone through a really difficult period in the 80s around fierce spearfishing initiatives. And so this video system, or this kind of website, which is no longer part the research lab that created it is no longer getting funding. But at one point they were doing videos around these subjects, and they're only like 2 to 3 minutes, and I think we have time to potentially share one. But they highlight in this kind of everyday forum and commitment the subject of Native Americans in contemporary Wisconsin society, which is really quite remarkable. So let's just see one. Let's see. I want to see spearfishing. There we go. You guys will be pretty surprised, I think, by the depth of this video. If I can show it. Here we go. Okay.
I like to arrive at the landing before sun sets to ensure that we have a permit, but we really can't start fishing until it's dark enough to be able to use the headlamps. If the fishing is good, we'll be on the water until we have all the fish that our permits allow us to take. I give tobacco for those water spirits, and I ask for safety. I love having Samuel and Benici in the boat. I love seeing young Ojibwe men becoming providers for their family. It's like the opportunities I was given by my older brothers. I started in the late 80s fishing with my brothers. There were certain lakes that they wouldn't take me on, lakes that they knew that there was going to be trouble. They didn't necessarily want me to witness the racial slurs and stuff getting thrown at us and things like that. Now that I have my own boys fishing with us, I understand why they did that. The spearing controversy for some people will probably always be there. They just don't understand why we do this. Spearing happens in very shallow water. The fish always determine when we're allowed to spear. When the lake reaches a certain temperature, that triggers the spawn and the fish will come in. Basically, what we're looking for is a reflection of a walleye's eye. It'll illuminate a little bit, and that way you can pick it out.
Spot here.
For us, anytime we fish or hunt, maybe there's a little bit of sport in it, but the actual taking something, whether it's wild rice or syrup or a fish or a deer, being able to take those things, being able to go out and harvest fish means that I can be a contributing member of the community. We've fished for elders. We've fished for single mothers. We always try to give as much as we can away. There's a lot of honor in that. When I drive the boat, I always worry about a lot of different things, obstacles in the water. I worry about trees hanging over. I worry about docks and private property. We've had people standing on docks saying things. We've had people shine lights at us, throw rocks at us. It's always in the back of your head. But in the same respect, we've had a lot of people that are just curious and seem very supportive and very interested in what we do. Even though our techniques have maybe changed a little bit, knowing that that fish coming off a long winter is something that all the Ojibwe people that came before us since the creation of the world tasted the exact same fish that we taste now. We live in an Americanized society, and the federal government has wanted us to assimilate. And for a large part, we are, But then there's also the other side. The Ojibwe education is something we have to survive as Ojibwe. Tasting that fish is part of that, having that living history. I spear fish because I'm Ojibwe. That's who we are. That's what we do.
Well, I hope that wasn't too long.
No, not at all. And I'm really grateful that you showed us that video. I want to just point to the time that we have about 10 minutes left, and we've got a few questions already queued up, but please feel free to continue in the chat. Sorry, I'm struggling to keep all of my windows together. But another question that we have from the chat, this is several people have been asking about primary sources. Can you suggest what are some particular primary sources or a pairing of a historical book that can be used to engage students in introductory courses? Any primary source recommendations that you have or book pairings for courses?
I mentioned the First Peoples documentary history by Colin Calloway earlier. It is full of primary sources with kind of introductory chapters. There's a small series it's related actually. Bedford St. Martin's is the publisher of First Peoples. They also do these sets of like primary source collections. A good one is called Talking Back to Civilization by Fred Hoxie. It's a collection of primary sources of largely Native Americans of the reservation era who were challenging these forms of assimilation that the federal government and its allies were advancing. It's hard to think of really more recent contemporary primary source kind of anthologies or collections. Many of these materials are not hard to find online because the online systems have become quite almost like overwhelming. There's a series of tribal newspapers, the Navajo Times, something called Akwesasne Notes, Indian Country Today, have all been either digitized or heavily kind of archived in accessible ways. Sometimes letters from like Native American authors are very helpful. Prominent American Indian writers such as Leslie Marmon Silko or N. Scott Momaday have kind of collection of their letters or write are kind of organized, often edited by others. Um, it's such a big subject that I'm a little hesitant with primary sources because I think treaties themselves are helpful, and there's a very famous volume of all the Indian treaties compiled by a early 20th century scholar by the name of Charles Kapler. But treaties are very dense, and so to read a treaty might require a little guidance if one is unfamiliar with the subject. So I write a lot about the Lakota Treaty of 1868, often referred to as the Fort Laramie Treaty, in chapter 10 in the book. And that treaty just has, even like if one reads some of the just separate articles, you get a sense of the vast kind of reorganization that a treaty can try to initiate. So lots of primary sources to draw upon. Someone is recommending something in the chat.
I think there have been wonderful. Thank you, and wonderful to see resources being shared between our amongst our audience today. Another question. Thinking about the post-World War II era, your book includes eras and topics where Native peoples are not always addressed in state standards, textbooks, or common curricula. Take, for example, the Cold War. But what sources or examples might help better integrate Native American perspectives into these topics or eras, especially post-World War II?
I was being a little particularly intentional in that chapter, in part because so many visions of American history of Native peoples end in the 19th century, and even like some of the best-selling books in Native American history, like "Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee," have this kind of nostalgic or romantic vision that is just, it's incompatible with contemporary Native America, which is a place full of challenge and complexity and diversity and contestations of various kinds. So like any, social world. So this kind of sense of singular or simplistic approach to Native American history can't help us in the present. So in this chapter 12, which kind of opens in the post-war era, it's intentionally saying, wait a minute, 60% of the uranium used in the U.S. nuclear arsenal is coming from Navajo lands. The vast majority of these bombs are being tested on Pueblo or Western Shoshone territories. The massive hydro developments along the Missouri or along the Columbia are flooding Indian homelands. How are we thought of modern America outside of this subject? It does then take a kind of policy turn to look at how this kind of era is also forming Native American policy. So we lose, some tracking of the kind of global Cold War dimensions. But essentially, there is a kind of indigenous layer to 20th century or kind of global international history that hasn't been sufficiently explored. And there's some great scholars who are kind of helping redress this a bit. And there's a reissued kind of classic text from Canada called The Fourth World by a First Nation writer by the name of George Manuel that recently was republished. And it kind of highlights how there is this kind of intellectual response by Native Americans throughout the 60s and 70s, both in Canada and the United States, to saying, hey, wait a minute, this discourse of civil rights or this kind of growing third world movement, it's not really helpful for us. We don't want rights. We want power. We don't want to be integrated. We want to be removed, just remain at a distance. And Manuel is even saying, even this kind of world of kind of multi-power first, second, and third world doesn't have space for Native nations or Native peoples. We need a vision of what he called the fourth world. And ironically, for me as a kind of participant in this academic world, throughout the 70s and 80s, a lot of critiques of kind of what we might call Western metaphysics or Western modernity were being deployed across the globe, creating what became known as post-colonial studies for a while. And even that field had very limited space for indigenous people because it was mainly coming out of former colonized spaces like India or South Asia. And by the end of the 20th century, kind of the rumblings were starting to occur when indigenous studies and related kind of scholars were trying to say, you know, this whole vision of what we think of as kind of colonialism or post-colonialism or global multiculturalism, it just doesn't work to explain the experience of indigenous peoples whose lands have been expropriated by a kind of foreign or a settler community. We need a new paradigm. And it's not coincidental that it came out of Australia from an anthropologist named Patrick Wolfe, who developed the idea of settler colonialism. And now we're talking about settler colonialism across the 21st century. And it's finally kind of a field or a kind of paradigm that can amplify the underuse or the less useful or the kind of less congruent paradigms for thinking about what are essentially ongoing processes. And so in this kind of classic formulation, Wolfe says that settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. And this book is not about events as much as it's about structures. The idea of history having an ongoing kind of processual kind of afterlife. And so what happens in 1760 kind of is still with us, and what happens in 1840 is still kind of with us in certain places and ways. So that's the kind of theme. And I didn't really dissect that video, but that video was really about the aftermath of the spearfishing crisis in Wisconsin and how non-Indian northern rural citizens became very incensed when the federal government protected Native people's rights to fish off reservations, as is guaranteed in the treaties they made with the federal government in the 1850s. So what happened in the 1850s, both in the Northwest and in the North and the Great Lakes, is still with us, literally. So those kind of rights and those kind of protective diplomatic accords have within them inherent commitments that the federal government has long maintained, but often ignored. So great questions. I know we're running out of time. Time for one last one, or should we just?
Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to stop it here. But Dr. Blackhawk, it has been a true pleasure to have you. There is a lot of gratitude in the chat for your answers to the questions, and plenty more that we could ask. But unfortunately, we're going to have to end here. Thank you again so much for spending time with us today and talking about your book and the research that you're doing and that others are doing in the field. Everyone will be taking a 15-minute break before we reconvene for our next panel at 3:30. Please join us as representatives of the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, the Library of Congress, and the Newberry Library introduce some of their new or forthcoming educational resources, answering some of the questions that you've been having in the chat today. We will close this Zoom session, but you can all use the same link to access the next panel, and we'll see you in just a few minutes. Thank you, Dr. Blackhawk.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.